Hi there, welcome back. You want to be a great photographer without breaking the bank? This video is for you. Let's do this. I'm gonna start with how I thought about photography when I got my first camera and how I think about it now. I'm gonna also share a lot of tips for you to approach photography in a much cheaper way. I'm gonna start with my first camera. This is the Nikon D5600. It's a very nice camera. When I first got this camera, my thought about photography was, I get a camera with interchangeable lenses because the body will give me raw files. Raw files are basically files with a lot of room for editing. And the lenses will give me the looks. And the problem is, lenses that give very good looks are very expensive. So when I started with the kit lens, which is not the best lens to start with. It has poor image quality. And also I got a tele lens. Now this lens was very useful when it comes to shooting stuff that are a bit far, but still the quality wasn't very good because, again, that's a very cheap lens. I thought I should invest a lot of money in lenses with good optics because otherwise I'm not gonna get like a crispy, sharp, good looking photo. Until I met Bruno. Bruno is a very nice friend of mine, and he introduced me to a world of cheap lenses. Photography has been around for a very long time. And over the years, especially when film cameras became more popular, a lot of companies produced very good lenses. And maybe they weren't cheap back then, but they are very cheap now. So he convinced me I would get this camera. This is a Pentax K3 Mark II. What's so special about the Pentax is the mount. Pentax have been making cameras for years, since the 1950s actually. And for a very long time, they haven't changed their mount. Even with modern cameras. This means if I bought a cheap Pentax lens like this one, this is the 55mm f1.8 from Pentax, and I've used this lens most of my photography life, I think. It's very cheap. You can get it for around $30 or $40, which is extremely cheap given the optic performance of this lens. And I can just pop it in any modern Pentax camera, which is pretty good. These lenses are amazing. And they perform very well. So the moment Bruno introduced me to this world of vintage lenses, this is what it's called. It's called vintage because it's very old, haha. I started buying a lot of vintage lenses because they're extremely cheap and nothing can go wrong here. Each lens average about $20 to $30 or euros, depending where you are. And the optics on those lenses are very good. It's a hit or a miss. Sometimes you can be very lucky. Sometimes you can get a lens that is extremely sharp and extremely good. And sometimes not so sharp. But it's worth trying since it's very cheap. This changed the way I approach photography. You need to have multiple lenses, and you need to have very good ones as well. Vintage lenses have a very good quality. They are very cheap, and they perform very well. But at the same time, you will miss some of the features of more modern lenses. One of them, for example, is autofocus. And it becomes a lot easier if you have focus assist on your camera. Unfortunately, this Pentax doesn't have that. I had to train myself for months to get the focus right. It was very annoying in the beginning, but it was so worth it. Of course, you can ask, can a 50-year-old lens like this one beat a modern one? I'm gonna do a very simple comparison to prove to you that a vintage lens can perform as good as a modern one. Therefore, making the argument of you don't have to break the bank or invest a lot of money in expensive lenses to take good shots or to have lenses that perform well. So I'm gonna do two comparisons. One is at the focal length of 55mm, I'm gonna use the Pentax SMC 55mm f1.8, and I'm gonna use the Sony Zeiss 55mm f1.8. The second comparison will be for the focal length 28mm. I'm gonna compare the Pentax SMC 28mm f2.8 with the Zeiss Batis 18mm f2.8. The reason why I'm comparing 28 to 18 because I don't have a modern 28mm lens, but I'm gonna use a wider one and then crop the image later. So let's see the comparison. So for the 55mm focal length, when you see the difference between the Pentax and the Zeiss one, you can see they are very similar in terms of optic performance. You can see the center has a certain level of sharpness. Maybe on the Pentax it's a bit more smudgy. However, when you move to the edges, they are very similar. When you stop down the aperture, they start becoming very similar. You can see the Zeiss performs a little bit better because Zeiss is kind of known for their sharpness, but still the Pentax performs very well. I bet now you're asking, what's the price difference between the Sony Zeiss 55mm f1.8 and the Pentax SMC 55mm f1.8. This thing cost €20, which is extremely cheap. This one cost €850. This basically means that this lens is over 40 times more expensive than the vintage one, and they perform very close to each other. Crazy, right? So if I'm gonna compare those two lenses in terms of optic quality, they are very similar. I've had this one for over a year and a half, and it's one of the best lenses I've ever used. And this one I got about 4 months ago, and since I got this one, I started using it instead of this one because of one reason: autofocus. If you're the kind of person who doesn't care about having autofocus, I would say buy this one. So the price of this lens is the equivalent of the price of maybe a low-end, mid-range camera, plus this lens, plus an adapter. Now let's do the comparison for the 28mm f2.8. As you can see, with the vintage lens wide open, it's very smudgy. It's not as sharp as the Zeiss lens, which was kind of expected because the Zeiss lens is extremely high-end. However, when you stop down the aperture, then they become very close. Still, the Zeiss has a better contrast to it, but again, the vintage lens didn't really ruin the shot. You can still get a very decent shot out of this vintage lens. So this lens is a part of a lineup from Zeiss called Zeiss Batis. It is the best lineup of lenses you can buy for the Sony mirrorless cameras, but they are very expensive. If I'm gonna buy it new, it would cost over €1,500. The one I have is used, and I was very lucky because the guy was selling it for 800. So that's basically about half the price. The reason why I'm saying this is you don't always have to pay a lot of money. You can just buy a used lens with a fraction of its original price. Assuming it's in a good condition, of course. A good condition for a lens is basically, for me at least, two things. It's still functioning, and there are no scratches on the glass. If those two are okay, then you can just buy it. You can have more equipment and more value for your money, and that will step up your photography game. I think if I didn't know about vintage lenses and how okay with it to buy second-hand lenses, I wouldn't have explored photography the same way I did. It simply wouldn't have gave me the chance to do so, or it would have broke the bank. Of course, you can ask what kind of vintage lens you can mount on which camera. So if you bought, for example, a Pentax lens, can you mount it on a Sony camera, for example, or a Nikon, or a Canon, or vice versa? If you bought a vintage Canon lens, can you mount it on Nikon? Can you mount it on Sony? This comes to a thing called the flange focal distance. The flange focal distance is basically the distance between the mount and the camera sensor or film. And the rule is, if you're gonna mount any lens on any camera, always mount the lens away from the sensor or the film as it should for its mount. The Sony camera I'm using right now, for example, the mount is much closer to the sensor. So this basically means I can get an adapter so it would keep the right distance between the lens and the sensor. There's an article on Wikipedia about flange focal distance, and it basically has a list of all camera mounts and the flange focal distance for all those mounts. You can basically assume if you bought a vintage lens that was designed for a certain mount, you can mount it on your camera only if the flange focal distance of the camera is less than or equal to that lens. I hope that's useful. So my approach was basically anytime I come across a vintage lens, I would buy it because it's cheap anyway, and I would see how it performs. And by the end, I reached a very interesting conclusion, is that when it comes to vintage lenses, those four are my main choices. The Pentax 28mm f2.8, the Pentax 135mm f3.5, the Pentax 55mm f1.8, and the Takumar 55mm f1.8. I should emphasize one very, very important thing. Other than the equipment that you can have for photography, the most important part is you. It's you practicing as much as possible. It's you refining your techniques. It's you getting the framing right. It's you getting the editing right. You always start with what you have. And when what you have becomes a limitation, then it's time for an upgrade. It always comes down to the photos you take. And when it comes to taking good photos, the important thing is the idea, is the story that's being told in that photo. So work on that with whatever equipment you have. And I hope with this kind of advice, the idea of buying used or old cameras and used or old lenses, I hope this makes it easier for you because it becomes a bit easier to explore photography once you know you don't have to pay as much. So yeah, I think that's it. Oh, wait. Before I end the video, I wanted to talk about this thing. This is basically a camera cage and connected to a bunch of rods, and this is an anamorphic lens. An anamorphic lens is a special type of lens that's used by cinematographers. It was originally invented to shoot widescreen movies on regular film. It basically gives this very filmic look. Your brain kind of can identify the anamorphic look and can instantly say, oh, that's a film. That's it for this video. If you have a camera, try looking for a vintage lens. There are a lot of websites and forums that actually review individual ones, so it will give you a very nice reference. Yeah, and explore that for a bit. And if you don't have a camera, you can always buy a used one for like much less of the original price. Always do it, always take photos, always try to improve your style, improve your editing, and you will be a great photographer. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked the video, please hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.